All right, everyone. I figured I'd do this reaction today. It's a little different from what I normally do, but it's this video that's come out about why we love crustaceans and fear insects. This is a topic that keeps coming up recently. It is kind of we should eat insects. Why don't we eat insects? I've done some commentary on this topic before. I find it extremely annoying. But this video goes more into some of the taxonomy. But I'll give my reaction to this and explain some of the more complicated things that go on with this. And I have some problems with this video, but I figure I'd talk about it. It's a well-done video. There's some neat crustaceans in it, so let's talk about it.
I love crustaceans. I love keeping them in tanks and watching them do their weird, crabby, lobstery stuff. I love their beady little eyes and their creepy little hands, and I love eating their sweet, flaky meat. When it comes to insects, I can appreciate them. I am certainly fascinated by them, but like most humans, I am at least a little bit afraid of them and more than a little repulsed by the idea of eating them. On its face,
so kind of the human kind of repulsion to insects is pretty natural. Land insects are generally associated with filth and disease. This is not kind of a new thing. Crustaceans generally are not associated with these things, kind of the broader, what we call crustaceans. So, and I'll go into this a little bit later. The culinary descriptor of crustacean is not the same as the biological descriptor. Similar with how like the culinary descriptor of a fruit and a vegetable are not the same as the biological definition of a fruit and a vegetable. So, for instance, everyone knows this one, like tomatoes are technically fruits, but we call them vegetables. But that's the same with like cucumbers and eggplants and peppers. Like those are all biologically fruit, but that's not how they're treated culinarily. When we talk about crustaceans culinarily, we're really talking about crabs, lobsters, and shrimps. But that's not what we mean biologically when we say crustaceans. But besides that, insects are generally repulsive because of their association with filth, disease, bites, stings, kind of pain. And this, I would imagine, is pretty hardwired into us. It's not merely a social construct. It's similar with fear of snakes. There is a reason that all primates are afraid of snakes. Like this is a deep biological necessity because of predation and death associated with these animals.
this double standard that I apply to crabs versus bugs makes no sense considering that they are the same basic thing.
No, they're not, and this is really annoying. And he goes into this more, he talks about this a lot. So there is this group, and he'll go into this, there's this group called the Pancrustacea, which is, the larger categorization of all crustaceans and insects. But again, when we're talking about what normal people mean when they say crustaceans, they are not talking about anything even closely related to insects. So this is an obfuscation of the colloquial meaning of insect and crustacean through a very high order scientific classification, and it's just dishonest.
Insects are crustaceans. That is the mainstream phylogenetic view nowadays. Not all crustaceans are insects, but all insects are crustaceans, or at least pancrustaceans.
So we'll get into this. So I want to show you this. That is a true statement. All insects are Pancrustacea. Not all crustaceans are insects, but that's because crustaceans aren't a real classification. So if you are not familiar with taxonomy, this goes into some higher order classification of animals, and it can be confusing. So this is what a phylogenetic breakdown of the Pancrustacea looks like. This is just off Wikipedia if you want to go look at it. So Pancrustacea is this very high order classification. This is basically a subphylum. it's hard to get a or a less meaningful classification. This is a huge collection of Pancrustacea. Represents a huge collection of species. You're talking, 15 million species represented in this group. It's an enormous number. All the way down here is Hexapoda. This is where you would find the insects. Everything else here, as it's shown here, is Crustacea. Crustacea is a paraphyletic group. It does not refer to a specific, cohesive, related group of insects. Of animals. It refers to all of the different groups here in a biological sense, except for the hexapods, which is why this is considered paraphyletic. If it also referred to the hexapods, then it would be monophyletic. But so not everything in this categorization is related, but not all things which are related are in this categorization. So off the face of it, when he says all hexapods are Pancrustacea, that is true. Hexapods are a class within, or a subphylum within the Pancrustacea. The Pancrustacea are just referred to as a clade because it doesn't have a specific nomenclature associated with that categorization. What I mean when I say that his representation of this is dishonest is because he is talking about this in a culinary sense and obfuscating it with the biological terminology. If you were to ask someone to categorize the things within the Pancrustacea, if you were to ask a normal person or even a biologist, they would not be able to tell you what creatures are in most of these higher order groups. A lot of these are microscopic animals. But it has absolutely no bearing on the culinary categorization of these things. When people are talking about the crustaceans that they eat, all they are talking about are the Thecostraca and the Malacostraca. And not even all of them. There's only a handful of species within those two groups which are eaten. All of these other groups, the Ostracoda, the Brachyneura, all these things, these are not things which are normally eaten. Most of these things are krill and microscopic sorts of things like that, parasitic fish lice, and all these other sort of nonsense which you would never eat. And within these groups, so the Thecostraca are the only thing that I can think of in that group which we would eat are gooseneck barnacles. Everything else in that group would be considered non-edible or not desirable to eat. And then within the Malacostraca, you have all of these other groups within the Malacostraca, and the only real thing that we eat within this group are the decapods. The decapods are the crabs, the shrimp, and the lobsters. All of these other animals which are included are not things which you would ever want to eat. They're all tiny or disgusting. They're just not something that'd be like, oh, well, what's the double standard here? There is no double standard here, because the standard is we only eat things that we want to eat and everything else we don't eat. This sort of classification up here, like, well, why don't we eat the Pancrustacea? This is such a high order classification that it would be the equivalent of saying, well, why don't we eat all of the vertebrata, all of the vertebrates? Why aren't we willing to eat everything with a backbone or with a spine? Like, there's plenty of animals which we are not particularly willing to eat, which have spines. People don't just eat everything that has bones. Like, it's just a stupid classification. But he's intentionally obfuscating the culinary uses behind a biological high-order classification. It's just nonsense.
Every animal in this steamer basket is now considered under the taxonomic umbrella Pancrustacea. They're all in the same clade, and believe it or not, bugs taste like crabs too, if you eat them a certain way. I'm gonna show you.
So this goes into kind of the recent push where you will eat the bugs, basically. There's been a big media push for the last several years that, oh, we should be eating more insects. No, we shouldn't. Stop pushing this nonsense. People don't want to eat disgusting insects. No, people don't want to eat crickets. They're a niche thing, and they're relatively disgusting. There's a lot of reasons that you shouldn't eat insects. 1, they're teeming with parasites. 2, they're just kind of gross. 3, they're not that nutritionally dense. I don't care what people say. They're mostly made of chitin, which you can digest to some extent, which he goes in later and says it's not digestible. Mammals produce chitinases. You can digest it. It's just not particularly delicious, and it's not particularly nutritious. And worst case scenario, you end up with some horrible parasite that you don't want to have to deal with.
Crustaceans. Every animal in this steamer basket is now considered under the taxonomic umbrella Pancrustacea. They're all in the same clade, and believe it or not, bugs taste like crabs too, if you eat them a certain way. I'm gonna show you.
This is just going back to the more recent media phenomenon of "you will eat the bugs" sort of messaging, where everyone should be eating bugs. No, stop listening to these people. You don't need to eat things that you find disgusting. Foodies are generally intolerable. Generally speaking, people are pretty picky with the foods that they eat. Some people don't like pork. Some people don't like beef. There's no push to eat all the animals. This is just nonsense. They're not, worst case scenario, you end up eating these insects and you end up with some horrible parasite because insects are teeming with parasites. No one wants to ever talk about that though. So it's just avoid them. This is nonsense.
The big difference between insects and land crabs, like my vampire crabs here, is how recently their ancestors first crawled up out of the water. This is, of course, a profound oversimplification, but big picture, aquatic crabs probably first started colonizing dry land 200 million years ago. Insects have been on dry land since about 500 million years ago, and they are, in many ways, more adapted to life in the open air. Most obviously, a lot of them have wings, which don't do you much good underwater. Crabs have gills, whereas insects don't have any kind of lung-like apparatus at all. This is, again, an oversimplification, but rather than having a whole pulmonary system like we have, what insects have more so is basically just vent holes. They're covered in these teeny little tubes called trachea that allow oxygen from the atmosphere to just kind of diffuse into their tissues. It is more complicated than that.
So yeah, that is an oversimplification. They do a lot of passive breathing through this tracheal system. The openings are called spiracles. But some insects are capable of active breathing, specifically insects that spend a lot of time flying. They have air sacs within them which they can pump with their muscles in order to pump oxygen in and out of them. But other arthropods do have lung-like structures, like spiders do have these things called book lungs. But also insects do have gills as well. Aquatic insects do have gills. A gill system that is evolved from this tracheal system.
But this may be one reason why insects tend to be so small, which is a factor that has major culinary implications. There actually used to be giant insects. About 300 million years ago, there was proportionally a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere, and that...
So he'll go into two things here, which is correct. Insects are size limited because of their respiratory system, because they can't supply enough oxygen to all of their tissues through passive breathing. But they are also size limited because they're made out of chitin. Their exoskeleton is predominantly made of chitin, which is a carbohydrate, and it's fairly brittle. So once you get to a certain size, if you're not in the water, you will collapse under your own weight. Which is why you can have very, very large crabs and things like that, like coconut crabs if you've ever seen them, because they spend the majority of their time in the water. And so their weight is supported when they're developing so they don't collapse in on themselves. There used to be enormous arthropods in the water, they were called thunder scorpions, I believe, and they could be 20 feet long. But you're not going to see that on the land.
Is thought to have supported gigantism among a lot of land animals, including dinosaurs and also bugs, especially if you're an animal that respirates in a relatively passive way, as bugs do. That really could have supported just much larger bodied organisms like this dragonfly from about 300 million years ago that I'm presenting roughly in scale with my body. Big sucker. You could probably have cut some nice meaty medallions off of that thorax. Weight may have also provided some downward evolutionary pressure on insect size. One defining feature of pancrustaceans, and indeed all arthropods, is their exoskeletons. It's simply easier to haul around a giant heavy set of armor amid the buoyancy of water. There are other hypotheses about why insects tend to be so small. One is that large flying insects may have been outcompeted by flying dinosaurs, aka birds. Remember that dino nuggets literally are dino nuggets. But however it happened, even the biggest insects on Earth today are still small enough that you can't get much meat out of them. There's just not much muscle tissue hiding under that armor, so...
Yeah, so this is an interesting point. There's kind of two things here. One, why are insects so small? So one of the other reasons is there's not a huge benefit to being giant, especially if you're an R-selected species where you go through a boom-bust cycle where the resources are really scarce and you have to use up the resources as they come in, and maybe you're not guaranteed more resources in the near future. You don't necessarily want to be huge and need to consume a lot. Like if you're the size of a blue whale, the amount of food that you have to consume at any given time is enormous. Whereas if you're the size of an ant, it's a little different. But also with the culinary aspect of this, insects are overwhelmingly exoskeleton. They don't have a lot of soft tissue. Even their internal parts a lot of their internal parts are made up of exoskeleton. It's not necessarily sclerotized, it's not necessarily rock hard, but it is still exoskeleton. There's not a ton of muscle or organ tissue, and the muscles and organ tissues themselves tend to be extremely thin. For instance, like the stomach lining in most insects is only about 1 cell thick. It's not a ton of tissue. They exist, their soft body parts exist very sparingly because it's not super efficient for them to have tons of this soft tissue.
So when we do eat insects, as in the case of these crickets, we usually eat the whole body, shell and all. When Mexican cooks make chapulines, which are usually grasshoppers, and they don't usually buy them from the pet store, and they usually marinate and fry them crispy after boiling.
So yeah, they are eating exoskeleton and all, which isn't a huge problem. The more disgusting part of it is unlike the edible crustaceans like shrimp, which would be deveined, insects do not have their digestive system removed when you eat them, so you eat all of their shit as well. It's disgusting, so why eat these things?
Boiling them to kill them. After that, they fry them crispy, and that makes sense, because if you're going to eat a pancrustacean with its exoskeleton intact, well, you want to lean into that crunchy texture. Frying is better than steaming, let me tell you. That exoskeleton, by the way, is mostly made of chitin, kind of similar to cellulose in plants. It's an indigestible, fibrous molecule of the animal world instead of the plant world. It's animal fiber. And in yet another example of how fungi are more similar to animals than they are to plants, mushrooms are also held together with chitin rather than cellulose. Especially in these woody stems, chitin is really tough stuff, which is one reason why you can only cook mushrooms down so much. Eventually you're just kind of left with leather. A crab claw is also clad in chitin, which would make it inedible were it not for the crab's enormous size.
So, chitin is technically edible, I believe. I'm pretty sure humans do produce chitinase. They do digest chitin. But you wouldn't want to eat it. You don't, again, goes back to my problem with foodies. You don't have to shove everything into your mouth. Like, you can have things which you are not willing to eat.
It's big enough to where it is practical to crack open the exoskeleton and remove it, allowing you to slide out pure muscle tissue, pure meat.
I wouldn't say it's practical. I mean, most people don't eat crab meat or lobster meat regularly. And part of the reason it's so expensive is because it's a pain to handle. Like if you've ever tried to, I don't know, make crawfish etouffee or something, pulling all of the meat out of crawfish tails is an insanely time-consuming task. It's not that crawfish are some rare thing, it's that no one actually wants to spend the time preparing this. It's a rare treat, and it's kind of the same with lobster and crab. Lobsters and crabs aren't particularly difficult to get, They're just a pain to prepare. And, no one's going to do this with insects. There's not enough meat to justify it. You're just going to have to eat their digestive system and all. Enjoy all of the digestive crap that you're eating.
Eating a bug, like these beetle larvae from the pet store, this is like eating a tiny crab with the hard shell and the internal organs and everything fully intact, which is kind of disgusting to me and lots of other people, though some people do eat soft-shell crabs whole. Let's say we took these cooked larvae and we squeezed out their meaty insides like toothpaste. People do this with a rolling pin to get the meat out of smaller crab legs.
I mean, you can see it there. This is not meaty insides. This is literally their digestive tract. This is all just pre-digested shit and a little bit of meat.
That is pure bug meat, no shell. How does it taste? Like crab. Seriously, when you isolate the muscle tissue of bugs, it tastes like crab or shrimp, except without the taste of the sea in there. There's no fishy taste in there, it's just the taste of the meat. This should be hardly surprising given that crabs and bugs are basically the same thing. So,
I feel like that's a nonsense statement. It tastes like crab except for without the taste of the sea. I don't even know if I can imagine what a crab would taste like without the taste of the sea. Seafood tastes like the sea. Like it seems nonsense to me. Okay, so he just goes into the crustaceans he's creeped out by and why don't we eat those and various other things. I'll link the entire video in the description. Basically, I think this is all kind of nonsense. He misrepresents the culinary uses by using high-end biology to mask the situation. But you also don't feel bad that you're not interested in eating bugs. You don't need to. This is coming from an entomologist. You are allowed to be creeped out by insects. It's fine. Thanks. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.